By late April 1945, Adolf Hitler's mental and physical state had deteriorated severely. The once powerful dictator was a shadow of his former self, physically frail, emotionally erratic, and prone to outbursts of rage and paranoia. Hidden away in the confines of his Berlin bunker, he was faced with the inevitable collapse of his regime. The Third Reich, which he had envisioned as a thousand-year empire, was crumbling around him. Soviet forces had encircled Berlin, and Allied forces had advanced on Germany from the west. Hitler's inner circle had been reduced to a handful of loyal followers, many of whom had lost faith in their leader. Inside the bunker, there was an atmosphere of despair, as Hitler wrestled with the reality that the end was near. Outside the bunker walls, the city of Berlin was in ruins. The sound of artillery fire and the roar of Soviet tanks grew louder each day. As the noose tightened around the capital, Hitler's once unshakable belief in his own destiny faltered. He became increasingly isolated, issuing irrational orders to non-existent armies, refusing to leave the bunker, and making it clear to those around him that he had no intention of surrendering. These final days of the Third Reich would not only mark the downfall of Nazi Germany, but also the end of Hitler's own life. By the spring of 1945, Germany was in a state of complete disarray. Soviet forces, having fought their way through Eastern Europe, had reached the outskirts of Berlin. The battle for the capital was fierce and brutal, with German soldiers and civilians alike fighting a desperate, losing battle. The Soviet Red Army's relentless advance was met with fanatical resistance from German troops, many of whom knew that defeat was inevitable, yet continued to fight. Germany's military infrastructure was in shambles, with resources depleted, cities bombed to ruins, and millions of soldiers and civilians dead or displaced. The statistics of German losses are staggering. By April, over 5 million German soldiers had been killed in combat, and millions more had been captured or wounded. The civilian population, too, had suffered immensely, with cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin subjected to devastating air raids. Despite the overwhelming odds, many Germans still held out hope, driven by fear of Soviet retribution or sheer desperation. For others, propaganda and indoctrination kept them clinging to the notion of a miraculous reversal of fortunes. Accounts from this period describe widespread fear, hopelessness, and devastation. Civilians fled in terror as Soviet forces entered the city, knowing full well the horrors that awaited them: looting, mass rapes, and executions. Yet for some, surrender was not an option. Many chose to fight to the bitter end, while others turned to suicide, unwilling to face the consequences of defeat. By April 1945, it became clear to Hitler that his dream of a Nazi-dominated Europe was shattered. As the Red Army closed in on Berlin, and with Western allies pushing from the other side, Hitler's delusional belief in a last-minute victory gave way to despair. On April 22, 1945, in what can only be described as a mental and emotional collapse, Hitler erupted in a fit of rage during a meeting with his generals, finally admitting for the first time that the war was lost. This breakdown marked a critical turning point. Hitler, who had always projected an image of invincibility, now faced the harsh reality of his failed leadership. Instead of taking responsibility for Germany's collapse, he turned to blaming his commanders, his army, and even the German people for what he saw as their failure to defend his vision. One of the more peculiar moments during this period came with the news of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945. Hitler, grasping at any hope, believed that Roosevelt's passing might lead to a fracture among the Allied powers and potentially open the door to a peace treaty with the United States or Britain. This delusion, however, quickly faded as it became clear that the Allies remained united in their goal of Germany's total defeat. As the days passed, Hitler grew more irrational, unwilling to leave the bunker, and consumed by thoughts of betrayal. Those around him described his demeanor as one of despair mixed with bouts of manic energy, further fueling the collapse of his mental state. By late April 1945, the Red Army had made its final push into Berlin, and the sounds of battle were inching ever closer to Hitler's bunker. Artillery shells thundered overhead, and the once mighty German capital lay in ruins as Soviet soldiers fought street by street to capture the city. Inside the Führerbunker, the atmosphere was tense and filled with dread. Hitler's staff and military officers were fully aware that the end was near. The once proud Nazi regime had been reduced to this underground hideout, surrounded by death and destruction. Outside, Berlin had become a war zone, with Soviet tanks rolling through the streets and civilians caught in the crossfire. As the final hours ticked by, the mood in the bunker grew increasingly desperate. Hitler, once delusional about potential counterattacks or secret weapons, had finally acknowledged the inevitable defeat. He had withdrawn into himself, speaking only to his closest confidants, including Traudl Junge, his secretary, and Martin Bormann. In these final conversations, Hitler gave instructions for his body to be burned after his death, fearing the same fate that had befallen Mussolini, whose corpse had been desecrated by angry mobs. Hitler's paranoia and obsessive need to control his legacy were on full display in these moments. On April 30th, 1945, after saying his farewells to his inner circle, Hitler made the final decision to take his own life. With his wife, Eva Braun, by his side, he retreated to his private quarters. In a grim parallel to the destruction outside, Hitler and Braun ended their lives, she by cyanide and he by gunshot. As per his orders, their bodies were carried outside and hastily cremated in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. With their deaths, the final chapter of the Nazi regime was closed, leaving behind a devastated country and a world forever changed by Hitler's actions. The madness and tragedy of Hitler's final days offer a sobering reflection on the destructive power of fanaticism and unchecked authority. Even in the face of overwhelming defeat, Hitler remained committed to his warped ideology, unwilling to accept responsibility for the devastation he had caused. His final will and testament, filled with delusional justifications and grandiose claims, only solidified his legacy as a leader disconnected from reality. Instead of remorse, he chose to blame others, his generals, the German people, and the so-called Jewish conspiracy. Hitler's final days in the bunker serve as a stark reminder of the catastrophic consequences of totalitarian rule and the extreme lengths to which individuals can go to preserve their power and beliefs. As history continues to examine his leadership and the horrors of the Third Reich, Hitler's last moments stand as a testament to the dangers of absolute authority and the toll it can take on humanity. If you found this video informative, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more in-depth historical content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.